Nobody talks about the 48 hours that happened right after Farrah Fawcett died. Not the public mourning, not the tributes, not the televised memorials that played across every network simultaneously. The 48 hours that nobody talks about are the ones that involved a phone call, a will, and a number so specific and so deliberately chosen that the lawyer who read it aloud reportedly paused for a moment before continuing. $100,000. Left, in writing, by a dying woman who had every reason in the world to forget a man she had not been married to in nearly 3 decades, to the man she had not been married to in nearly 3 decades. And left nothing, not a single traceable dollar from an estate worth considerably more, to the man who had been sleeping beside her, holding her hand, and whose name appeared in the last words she ever spoke. Ryan O'Neal got her final breath. Lee Majors got her final statement. And if you think those two things are even remotely equivalent, you have not yet understood what Farrah Fawcett was actually saying with that document, or what it reveals about a love story that the world thought it understood and almost entirely got wrong. Because the version of this story that became famous, the triangle, the betrayal, the Hollywood scandal that sold magazines through the entire first half of the 80s, was missing the most important character. Not Farrah. Not Ryan. The most important character was the man who never raised his voice, never gave a revenge interview, never hired a publicist to manage the narrative in his favor. The man who, when asked directly about the worst thing that ever happened to him, said simply that he was lonely and miserable without her, and then went back to work. That man was Lee Majors. And the story of how he got from a dead-end attic in Kentucky to that $100,000 line in a dead woman's will is one of the most extraordinary quiet journeys in the entire history of American entertainment. It starts before any of the fame. It starts before Hollywood. It starts with a box of newspaper clippings and a boy who had no idea who he actually was. Harvey Lee Urey came into the world on April 23, 1939, in Wyandotte, Michigan, and the world immediately began taking things from him at a pace that would have destroyed most people before they were old enough to understand what was happening. His father died in a steel mill accident before Lee could form a memory of him. His mother was killed by a drunk driver when Lee was 18 months old. By the time he was capable of asking where his parents were, he was already living in Middlesboro, Kentucky, in the home of an aunt and uncle who loved him genuinely and raised him with care and consistency and gave him every advantage available to a working family in a small southern town, except the truth about where he came from and what had taken them from him. He found that truth during his teenage years, alone in the house, in a cardboard box pulled from an attic shelf that contained old newspaper clippings his family had kept and never shown him. The clippings explained everything. The accidents. The timeline. The names. The full dimensions of a loss he had been living inside without knowing its shape. What he did next, what happened in the private space between reading those clippings and walking back downstairs, is something he has never described in detail in any interview. But everything that followed in the next 7 decades suggests that what happened in that room was a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not a cinematic one. A quiet, private, absolute decision that the losses behind him would not be the defining fact of the life in front of him. He chose the name Majors from his football idol, Johnny Majors. He became a standout athlete. He earned a scholarship. He transferred to Eastern Kentucky University. He built a life around forward motion and physical discipline until a back injury redirected everything toward Los Angeles, where, at 25, he beat more than 400 competing actors, including a young, completely unknown Burt Reynolds, for the role of Heath Barkley on The Big Valley alongside Barbara Stanwyck. Stanwyck, one of the most professionally exacting people in the history of American film and television, handed him 3 rules that he has been quoting in interviews for 50 years because they were the only rules that turned out to be true in every situation and at every level of the industry. Be on time, know your lines, hit your mark. What she did not say out loud, but demonstrated every single working day on that set, was the 4th rule, the one that Lee Majors has followed more faithfully than any other principle in his public life. Silence, deployed correctly, is the most powerful statement available to a person who actually has something worth saying. His first marriage, to Kathy Robinson, collapsed in 1964 under the combined pressure of distance, financial instability, and the specific strain of one person pursuing an uncertain dream while the other waits for it to either materialize or fail. They had a son together, Lee Majors too. The relationship between Lee and his son never fully healed across the decades that followed, and the fact that Lee has addressed this in public almost never, in 50 years of interviews and fan appearances and television specials, is its own kind of honesty. Not concealment. Honesty. The honesty of a man who understands that some things are too real to perform for an audience. He dated Patty Chandler through the mid-60s with the easy generosity that people who knew him in that period consistently described as characteristic. He once kept her pet boa constrictor at his California ranch, which is a kind of devotion that does not get discussed enough in romantic contexts. There was also, suggested by the available evidence and confirmed by a single grinning lyric delivered on national television, something involving Sally Field during this period. Neither of them ever addressed it directly, which in the specific conversational grammar of Hollywood is its own form of confirmation. In 1981, when Lee recorded The Unknown Stuntman as the theme for The Fall Guy, he sang the line about Sally Field with the comfortable self-deprecation of a man who had decided that the most graceful way to acknowledge certain things was to get there first with a smile. Sally Field married Stephen Craig in 1968. That same year, something happened inside a talent agency office that would redirect every remaining year of Lee Majors' life in a direction he could not have mapped from where he was standing. His agent spread photographs of the agency's newest clients across a table in front of him and gave him the most casual instruction imaginable: pick the best-looking girl. Lee looked through the photographs. He made his selection without hesitating. The agent placed the call. On the other end was a 21-year-old woman from Corpus Christi, Texas, with almost no professional credits, no industry relationships, and a physical presence so completely and immediately remarkable that people who encountered her for the first time consistently reported the same involuntary response: a pause, a second look, an uncertainty about whether what they were seeing was something that actually existed in ordinary life. Her name was Farrah Fawcett. Their first date went badly enough that under any normal set of circumstances it would have been their only date. She ordered a scotch and coke with no meaningful experience of alcohol, became ill before the evening found any momentum, and left Lee sitting across from her uncertain whether she was repelled by him or simply by drinking. The following morning he sent 13 yellow roses to her door without overthinking it. She agreed to see him again. When he arrived to pick her up, she told People magazine years later, she melted into 1,000 pieces on the spot. Which is, when you consider the sequence of events, exactly the correct response to a man who watches you get sick on a first date and responds the next morning with 13 roses and zero apparent judgment. What developed between them over the years that followed had a quality that is genuinely unusual in that industry in any era. It was built on recognition rather than performance. Two people from the American South who had each bet everything on a version of themselves that the people back home had found puzzling, who found in each other the specific comfort of being understood by someone who had made the exact same wager on themselves and understood precisely what it had required. She called him Big Grumphead, in the tone of voice that turns an insult into a declaration of love. She described herself, years later, as someone who simply wanted to cook his meals and keep his house and be someone he could depend on completely. That was the woman he married in 1973. What he did after the wedding, what has been consistently underreported in every account of this story, was spend the next 3 years building her career alongside his own with the same deliberate investment he brought to everything else. He used his name and his industry access to get her visible credits when she had almost none. He pushed her toward every opportunity that crossed his path. He opened doors that would not have existed without him, not because she lacked talent, but because talent without a visible entry point is simply invisible in that world. When Charlie's Angels came along in 1976 and cast her as Jill Monroe, he was enthusiastic and fully supportive, even as the premiere episode made immediately clear that something was happening around Farrah's image that none of the existing frameworks for measuring popularity were equipped to quantify. It was not simply success. It was a cultural phenomenon, the kind that happens once in a generation and attaches itself to one specific face and changes what that face means to everyone who sees it. And the image at the center of that phenomenon, the red swimsuit, the incandescent smile, the hair that seemed to catch a wind that existed only for her, was chosen by Lee Majors. He has said it plainly, without drama, in more than one interview across the years. I picked out the poster. The famous one. I picked out the picture. 12 million copies sold. One of the most reproduced photographic images of the 20th century. Selected by the man who then watched the woman in it become something so large that the marriage they had built could no longer contain what she had become. Fame at that scale does not destroy marriages dramatically. It does it quietly, through accumulation, through the slow erosion of the shared daily life that marriages are actually made of beneath the legal contract and the public presentation. Their schedules stopped aligning. 14-hour days on separate productions became weeks of functional separation that became months, and then, in at least one documented stretch, something approaching a year. "There was a year when I think I saw her 2 weeks," Lee said in his 80s, with the flat precision of a man for whom that number has long since stopped being shocking and simply become part of the permanent arithmetic of his life. 2 weeks in a year is not a marriage. It is a legal status applied to two people living entirely separate lives in the same city. He encouraged her to leave Charlie's Angels after one season to pursue serious feature film work, because he believed in her capacity as an actress and wanted the industry to extend to her the respect that comes with being taken seriously in demanding roles rather than simply celebrated for the fact of her existence. The decision cost her $7 million in breach of contract litigation. The film she made afterward failed commercially and critically despite the salaries her visibility commanded. He had built the architecture of the opportunity with everything he had, and what was on the other side of it was not what either of them had imagined when they were building it together. He allowed himself, in one moment across the entire span of his public life, a single sentence of genuine unguarded honesty about this: "There are times when I think that perhaps I created a monster. But then, deep down, I know that's just not true." That sentence rewards close attention. It is not a contradiction. It is a man working through something in real time, arriving at the most generous available interpretation of a situation that was costing him more than he could fully say, and choosing generosity over accuracy because generosity was the thing he could live with. By 1979, the marriage was over in every way that actually matters. What had not yet happened, what converted a painful ending into something Lee Majors has been carrying at a different weight for 45 years, happened in Toronto in the autumn of that year, and it began with the most ordinary sentence he has ever spoken. He was in Canada filming The Last Chase when he ran into Ryan O'Neal, an old friend from the early 60s when both of them were young actors with everything still ahead of them, reconnecting now across careers that had fully materialized and years that had passed without much contact. The ease was immediate. The friendship picked up without effort. And when Ryan needed to return to Los Angeles, Lee said the thing. The exact words vary slightly depending on the telling, but the substance is always the same. "She is up there alone. Why don't you take her to dinner sometime?" He has described it, in the years since, with the quiet bewilderment of a man who has replayed a moment 10,000 times without ever arriving at a version of it that makes more sense. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a dramatic act. It was a man extending a small kindness toward two people he trusted, spoken with the complete casualness of someone who has not yet learned that certain favors change everything they touch. Ryan O'Neal held back for a week. He knew what he was feeling, and he understood that it was wrong, and he did not act on it immediately. Then a concert came up, an artist Farrah liked, and he had an excuse that felt innocent enough to use. The momentum that built after that first call moved the way these situations always move, with a speed and completeness that neither person inside it seemed willing or able to redirect. Lee found out the way he found out most things about the state of his own marriage during that period, from the outside, through the accumulation of evidence that no longer arranged itself into any innocent explanation. He called Ryan directly. He asked him to stop. Ryan said 4 words that closed the conversation permanently. "I can't. I really love her." When people ran their piece on the whole situation in 1980, Lee said the one thing he has ever said in any public forum that was completely stripped of management or strategy or image protection. "I may joke and tease around a lot, but the bottom line is I'm lonely and miserable without her." Read that sentence again. That is not a man performing vulnerability for an audience. That is a man who got caught in an honest moment and told the truth about what it actually feels like to lose the person you organized your entire existence around, and then said nothing further, gave no follow-up interviews, hired no one to position the story in his favor, and went directly back to work. The divorce was finalized on February 16, 1982. He made no statement. He held no press conference. He picked up the next project and kept going, which is the only response he has ever had to any obstacle his life has placed in his path, going all the way back to a teenager in Kentucky standing in an attic with a box of newspaper clippings and making a private decision about what kind of man he intended to become. The Fall Guy ran from 1981 through 1986 and accomplished something the industry has never fully credited him for. It proved that Lee Majors was not merely a man who had survived the machinery of television stardom, but a man who understood, at a level most performers never reach, how to build something durable and sustain it across time. 3 consecutive hit series in 3 consecutive decades, The Big Valley in the 60s, The $6 Million Man in the 70s, The Fall Guy in the 80s, is an achievement that almost no one in the complete history of American network television has matched, and almost no one in the conversation about television history ever raises it with the weight it deserves. He produced The Fall Guy. He sang its theme song himself, embedding inside a cheerful and self-aware lyric a reference to Sally Field that functioned as the most elegantly delivered public acknowledgement of personal history in the entire decade. He brought back collaborators from every previous chapter of his career because loyalty, for Lee Majors, was never a thing you said. It was a thing you demonstrated through the specific choices you made when it would have been easier and more convenient to simply move forward alone. He married Karen Velez in 1988, had 3 children together, and divorced in 1994 with the mutual agreement of 2 people who understood that what had ended was better left without a public postmortem. He spent his 50s in Florida, away from the machinery, not in retreat, but in the kind of deliberate quiet that a person chooses when they have been in continuous motion long enough to understand what it costs. In 2002, he married Faith Cross, 30 years younger, in a relationship that answered every piece of predictable commentary by lasting more than 2 decades, the longest and most genuinely settled union of his life. In 2003, he had heart surgery for a blocked artery and recovered with the same forward-moving matter-of-factness he has brought to every other thing his life has asked him to survive. When asked about Faith in 2019, he said, "It is a record in Hollywood." Quietly, without ceremony. Exactly the way he says everything that actually matters to him. In June 2009, with Farrah in the final weeks of her life and the cancer that had been documented in her own film about her illness now having taken everything it was going to take, Lee Majors picked up the telephone on her 62nd birthday and called her. They talked for 40 minutes. No one else was in the room. No one recorded it. No one wrote about it the following morning. Someone close to him mentioned it afterward, quietly and without elaboration, because that is the only register in which things of genuine significance in Lee Majors' life ever get communicated, quietly, without elaboration, once. Farrah Fawcett died on June 25, 2009. Ryan O'Neal reported that her last words to him were "I love you." Lee released a statement of 9 words that were chosen with the precision of a man who understood exactly what he wanted to say and exactly where the sentence needed to stop. And then the will was read. And the number sat there in the document, specific and deliberate and impossible to interpret as anything other than what it was. $100,000 to Lee Majors. Nothing to Ryan O'Neal. Not a symbolic amount. Not an afterthought. A number chosen by a woman who knew she was dying and knew exactly what she was doing with every dollar in that document, and understood completely what that particular line would communicate to anyone who read it with the full story in mind. Ryan O'Neal had her last words. Lee Majors had her last decision. And a last decision, made with full deliberation by a person who knows they are making it for the final time, is a more complete statement of truth than any last words spoken in the haze of a final hour. Lee Majors said almost nothing about it publicly. He has said almost nothing about most of the things in his life that have mattered most, which is not absence of feeling, but the opposite. The discipline of a man who learned in an attic in Kentucky that some truths are too important to dilute by explaining them. He was orphaned before he could speak. He discovered who he was from a cardboard box. He beat 400 men for his first real break. He ran in slow motion across the televisions of 70 countries. He chose the photograph that turned the woman he loved into a century-defining image. He asked an old friend to take her to dinner. He called her 40 minutes before she was gone. And she answered, in the most permanent document available to a dying person, that some things do not end just because they appear to. At 87, Lee Majors is still here. Still married to Faith. Still showing up to sign things for people who remember watching him run. Still keeping his mouth shut when silence is the most honest thing available. The woman he could never forget made sure, with her last deliberate act, to leave the record straight about what she never forgot either.